So I'd like to say good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Canberra Jung Society. Again, my name's Jean James. I'm the president of the Jung Society, if you don't know me. And tonight we'll be hearing from our very own Robert, Tulip, about Carl Jung's book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. Rob has a Master's Honours degree in philosophy from Macquarie University. After 30 years working for the federal government, he is now returning to focus on his intellectual interests, especially the philosophical problems of psychology and religion, and also in music. Rob is just back from a 220-kilometre hike through the Lyneham Trail in the Northern Territory, during which he had plenty of time to reflect on matters philosophical and spiritual. Rob will speak for an hour or so, then we'll have a brief supper break, then return for discussion and questions and finish at 10, and a lovely supper at the back. So if you want to snack on later, that's fine. Don't forget that if you'd like to join the Society, it's the great time, because then you can come to our meetings every month at no further cost. You'll receive the newsletters and borrowing access to the library, so you can borrow as many books as you want, as long as we know about and return them, if you're a member. Welcome, Robert. And so we'd like to present Robert to you. Robert is our librarian now. He's taken over that job, which is fantastic. At the back of the room we have books that were in our library, but we're taking them out because we want to put better quality books in our library now. We're becoming a bit more discerning. So if you want to have a look at these books at the back and just give us a donation of $1 or a couple of dollars, then you're welcome to take the books home to your house. We don't really want them sitting there. So thank you very much, and I'll give you over to Robert.
Thanks very much, Jean, and it's really a great pleasure to be here and speak with you about Carl Jung. It's just been one of my abiding interests over many years, and to be able to speak about Modern Man in Search of a Soul. It's a really profound book, which I think has really got abiding relevance for today. So I'm going to read a paper just because it's a fairly dense book. Now I've got, pretty sure I have a copy of it here somewhere or other. No, I'll put it down somewhere. Anyway, here it is. Modern Man in Search of a Soul. It's a collection of 11 essays on various themes, as I'll explain. And it's really got an intense power and clarity of Jung's healing vision for the human psyche, which I think is one of the magnificent things about Carl Jung as one of the great thinkers of the last century. 11 short essays published in English translation in 1933, written as Europe was grappling with the trauma and the sorrow of the First World War, and in the context of the rise of demagogic politics in the 1930s. So there are some resonances for what Jung was talking about at that time with our world today. Broad confusion around cultural identity is one of Jung's real themes, and these essays have this classic lucidity and enduring relevance, revealing aspects of Jung's thought which with great potential to disrupt our prevailing thinking today. So in this talk, I want to discuss ideas that Jung expressed about philosophy and psychology, politics and religion, looking at implications about the place of soul in our modern cultural world. So my method in preparing the talk was first to read the book and to just go through with a pencil and underline the lines that I thought were just particularly interesting and significant. And then, as Jean mentioned, I was walking the Larapinta Trail in Central Australia, which extends for about 200 kilometres west from Alice Springs. And It's a magnificent place to go. It was like a spiritual pilgrimage to go out there. This deep, silent spirituality of the desert, and just in my tent each night, just copying out the lines that I'd underlined into my journal, and just using that as a first draft, and then trying to edit that into some sort of a coherent argument, mostly reflecting Jung's ideas, but also mixed with my interpretation. So the overall theme of Modern Man in Search of a Soul, perhaps most strongly expressed in the essay on the spiritual problems of modern man, is that rational science needs to combine with spiritual identity to provide meaning for life. So Jung calls for a renewal of religious sentiment, but reconciled with reason, as the way to overcome the deep neurosis, even psychosis, of prevailing modern life. Of course, it was published just as Hitler was coming to power, so there's this underlying sense of a demonic unconscious forces driving this psychotic mentality of mass politics pervading Jung's analysis. And a starting point is the scale of deception in modern life, with honest confession far harder than deceptive illusion. And if you've read anything of Jung's work, his psychoanalysis, he engages this problem of how we tell lies to ourselves, and it's something that he really learnt or engaged with from Freud. And as a result of this illusion, these half-formed ideas acquire a popular certainty and take on the structure of mythology. So myths as the stories that give meaning to people's lives, but often with stories that involve a great deal of delusion. And the unconscious power of myth is seen most vividly for Jung in his early work in the violent political reaction that Freud encountered as from what Jung calls those who believed illusions on principle. And so, looking at Jung's approach to philosophy in this book, this theme, it exposes this really stark polarisation between tradition and modernity that emerged in the 19th century most strongly, and it continues to strongly influence us now. Jung's discussion of philosophy, it reminds me a bit of Karl Marx's comment that history repeats first as tragedy and then as farce. There seems to be a tragic clarity in the culture war in the 1930s between science and religion, compared to the rather farcical confusion of intellectual debates today. I'm not sure if that's a fair comment, but that's how it appeared to me. One of his essays is called Basic Postulates of Analytic Psychology, and there Jung looks at the history of the idea of the soul as how, before the rise of modern scientific enlightenment, soul was viewed as a substance, and then the emerging modern philosophy of scientific materialism entirely rejected spiritual traditions and just laughed at everything that couldn't be measured. So there's been a modern negation of metaphysics. So this idea from science that metaphysical thinking is just obsolete and wrong. And this negation of metaphysics produced a radical change of view in European thought. And Jung felt that this change of thinking dated back to the Protestant Reformation. But he looks at it more in terms of how modern thought has been closely associated with the European conquest of the world since the age of discovery. And the age of discovery gave us this empirical breadth. You know, we could spread out across the world and discover everything, but at the cost of a loss of spiritual depth. So there's a shallow psychology of modernity illustrated for Jung by this imperial domination of philosophy, this empirical materialism with its automatic assumption that mind is dependent on matter. And now that's something that for modern thinking is just so automatic that anybody who questions it, as Jung does, that mind is a part of and dependent on matter, it's just not something that can be questioned in modern philosophy, and yet that's what Jung is asking. So he's looking at the history of ideas and observing how futile it was to try to resist against this great power of scientific materialism, this what he calls the irrational and emotional surrender to the physical world as all important. So just thinking, what is more important, the physical world or the world of our ideas? And it raises a philosophical question about whether we should base our views on the primacy of matter or of spirit. Jung saw the problem that just basing our thinking on the assumption that matter is primary is what he called naturalistic values that destroy spiritual development. But then a spiritual focus can also have the opposing problems of ignoring biology. So there's this conflict, this tension between nature and mind with both spiritual and material aspects. So our sense of reality combines the physical and mental. So we need to integrate our descriptions of material facts together with our construction of spiritual values, constructing our world. Jung's argument links psychology to the problem of how we know anything at all, known as epistemology. So mind and matter are not just self-evident and objective features of an objective reality. They are concepts. They emerge within a worldview as symbols dictated by the spirit of the age. And Jung's feeling is that the modern world is still largely in the grip of a metaphysical assertion that only matter is real. And I find this challenge to our dominant thinking quite hard to grasp. I've always just been quite materialistic in my thinking, and that was part of Jung's clash with Freud, that Freud was saying, let's remain within the modern framework of scientific materialism, and Jung felt that was not something that engaged with human being. So the modern world is still largely in the grip of this view that only matter is real. And so it's really valuable to look at how Jung discusses these themes with the whole question of what is the soul? Does it matter if we have a soul? So the scientific revolution of the modern Enlightenment didn't actually do away with metaphysics, as some philosophers have claimed, but rather it just introduced a new metaphysics, one that supplanted mind with matter and rejected the intangible and obscure elements of the mind with the older thinking and sought to ground values in facts, that is, an evidence-based, giving primacy, moral primacy to logic and evidence, and elevating common sense as the absolute measure of truth. So Jung is challenging this scientific primacy of common sense as an absolute measure of truth. He's saying perhaps there's something deeper, and because he sees that there's been an inversion of the older religious dogmas, and modernity has now elevated materialism to a form of religious orthodoxy, and modernity considers dissent against materialism as some sort of socially dangerous blasphemy. Now, this is Jung's rather provocative comment in the 1930s. I'm really not sure how true that remains today. I'd be interested in people's thoughts about that when we come back for a discussion. So Jung sees it anyway as a new metaphysics that asserts that the psyche, the human mind, has purely material causes, and it rejects the old idea of the soul. It says the soul is repugnant heresy. The religion had its old presuppositions, presumptions of immortality, the divine healing energy in the world, the existence of a spiritual world beyond the physical. The modern framework says they're all obsolete and wrong. But Jung sees a basic problem with seeing the mind in material terms in this way. Our mind constructs our world in terms of culture and values and subjective experience. These are psychological realities that only partly connect to this scientific assumption that we discover our world through objective empirical description. Jung is giving primacy in human life to cultural imagination. And I think that that's a really powerful idea in terms of how our values define what we do and who we are. He presents it in this light a quite interesting commentary on evolution, on Darwinian evolution, which of course Jung is coming from a scientific context where Darwin's discoveries are generally accepted. But then he's asking, well, what does it mean in terms of metaphysics? And so he notes the modern discovery that apes evolved into humans also brings a bunch of philosophical assumptions into the mechanistic worldview. And the problem is that matter, the natural evolution of genetics, has displaced the universal creative God. And Jung is wanting to find some room for a conversation about God, even within a scientific world. And so the evolutionary framework has a lack of soul, is Jung's basic problem. And he's wondering, how can we recover a sense of soul within a scientific worldview? It reflects the economic and political power of the materialist philosophy, where evidence is the sole criterion of truth, leaving no place for intuition, no place for imagination. Jung's underlying point here is that the spiritual identity of the human psyche is seen in language and culture, and it's qualitatively different from a merely animal existence. But the materialist thinking tends to deprecate this central role of spiritual identity in human life. So the historical achievement of scientific analysis of matter is seen in the spatial growth of European power through the conquest of the world. And against this empirical might of science, Jung is asking about the cultural identity that emerges from a sense of history. So we have the modern world, which is focused on space, and Jung is asking about time and the temporal reach of a living sense of history that connects us with the past and future. So he's asking us to see both space and time as constituting reality, and suggesting that our modern world is not sufficiently focused on time. Science focuses too much on space, at least within the historical scale of human existence. So the modern world asserts that only matter is real, and we forget how our mind enables us to retain continuity with the past. So our remembering of things from the past is really very difficult to reduce to a material philosophy of matter in motion. And we can see similar cultural changes that we experience today in past philosophy, in past history. So this continuity with the past generates our understanding of the soul as our underlying character. And this sense of continuity with the past is entirely different from the scientific reduction of ideas to a material substrate. And the soulless reduction of ideas to matter is the method that Jung criticises in philosophy, also in psychology, where the assertion of the primacy of neuroscience analysis of instincts and drives has, in some respects, replaced an integrated theory of soul. So how can psychology return to an integrated theory of soul is Jung's question. So this materialist philosophy of modern secular logic dominates what Jung calls the uncanny power of the zeitgeist. So there's this spirit of the age which is dominated by materialist philosophy, and this creating this physical empiricism in the scientific world which no one can stand against, which Jung considers has a deep prejudice against spiritual existence. So he cites the old vertical vision of God as a transcendent and eternal source of order, which is just excluded by science, really. It's a secular prejudice that emerges both consciously and unconsciously. The zeitgeist, as the spirit of the age, is reflected in dominant assumptions of cultural values and evolves in the way Hegel described it, from a thesis giving rise to its antithesis and then integrating as a synthesis. So Jung notes that the evolution in the history of ideas always involves just such an unconscious reaction, what Hegel called a dialectic, against past biases. But the problem is that, for example, we had the thesis that human identity was spiritual, then that produced the antithesis that human identity is material. And Jung sees that as an overreach, a bias in the opposite direction. So the present is as guilty as the past of an unbalanced thinking, and the challenge is to find some sort of integration, a synthesis. So overestimation of the role of physical causation in life is the unbalanced metaphysical delusion that Jung blames for the modern loss of soul, resulting in a lack of interpersonal spiritual connection. And the primacy of the physical is an ideology that makes soul dependent on body, a psychology without the psyche. So as a result, we have a consciously constructed world that ignores and rejects the existence of unconscious life. And this is the problem that Jung sees as at the root of neurosis and psychosis. Jung accepts that illusions are actual for the psyche, including in common religious stories of what's real. And it's a mythological attitude that's been quite dominant in human life, which of course is in tension with the modern view that there must be some discoverable physical line of material connection between an action and its causes. So Jung's critiquing this material outlook by saying, well, it's just far too difficult to connect our thoughts with the material causes of them. So his point is that human action is primarily caused by cultural ideas and beliefs rather than anything material. So the suggestion that ideas and beliefs can be reduced to physical causes is itself a metaphysical assertion. So spiritual identity in the modern framework can be explained by physics, which is the philosophy of logical positivism. But for Jung, that's more a way of asserting the cultural value of physics and a way of denigrating spirituality and the soul. So quite an unbalanced perspective. There's a gulf between subjective identity and its material substrate. It can't be bridged by science. So Jung is insisting that our spiritual identity has a psychological autonomy. And this idea of the autonomy of the spirit is unpopular in modern thought, but Jung's argument is that mind is as much a creation of our imagination as matter is a creation of our imagination in our conceptual framework. So spirit, for Jung, is a timeless life force that rejects biochemical reduction. And yet, this reduction is the dominant tendency of empirical science of measurement. So the ego, psychologically speaking, from this spiritual perspective, grows from the unconscious springs of life in the depth of the soul, is the way Jung put it. From spirit as a non-spatial, non-located identity, grounded in the subliminal interior. And to be modern is to reject these unconscious springs of the soul in favour of this secular materialist philosophy, and denying that the psyche could arise from any such inaccessible spiritual principle. But we have no idea how our psyche, how our mind, can arise directly from physical matter. But against that, we have modern science insisting that the idea of a spiritual life force is illusory. So we see this gulf between science and spirituality, and it's this separation that Jung sees as the breeding ground for neurosis. It's this gap between our psyche, understood as encompassing our soul, and our conscious mind. So between soul and ego, requires cultural, spiritual analysis of how human identity can be made whole. And it's this challenge of integrity, of restoring a wholeness to a broken human identity that is one of the big focuses that Carl Jung brings to psychology as a challenge to the brokenness of the modern world, but in a way that is largely separate from scientific causal analysis, rather looking at symbolic meaning. So the springs of life, says Jung, arise not from our biology but from the depths of our soul. And even dreams can serve as sources of information, with the material methods only capable of measuring factors that are spatial, but the soul is not spatial. So, Jung says we can personify the collective unconscious, another of his great ideas, as the designer of age-old dreams from 100 generations, with a living sense of the rhythm of growth, flowering and decay. Now, the collective unconscious is like a stream or ocean of images flowing into the mind. It's a source of knowledge, not just within the individual, but within the broader society. So, the point here is that consciousness derives from the unconscious and not the other way around. Our soul depends on a world system, a culture of spirit. And for Jung, that means assuming God as a being with will and mind. Now, that sort of language is difficult for any practical psychology, where the goal is outcomes for patients. But Jung's objective here isn't just clinical treatment, but societal diagnosis. So, these divisions about the purpose of psychology emerge in his essay on Freud and Jung, Contrasts. And Jung argues that Freud's focus on causal reduction of psychology overemphasises the pathological and negative aspects of life. So as a result, he says Freud can't understand religious experience. Jung, by contrast, prefers to look at humanity in the light of what is healthy and sound, building a psychology of the healthy mind integrated with philosophy and seeking rigorous critique of all assumptions. The underlying problem is that instinct and spirit are powerful forces, but we don't really know what they are. It's a deep challenge in psychology. They are not reducible to drives for sex and power, which was what Freud and Adler argued. Now, I'm approaching this from a philosophical perspective. Others who have more of a background in modern psychology may be interested to comment on how some of these debates have led to further discussion in more recent times. All of this material is, of course, dating from nearly a century ago. So, in Jung's view, the psychological phenomena of human spirituality deserve respect in their own terms. So, for him, all religion has some positive value in its statement of human identity. And the greatest spiritual value he sees in Gnostic religion, drawing knowledge of the cosmos from within the human soul, with human existence standing between equally vast inner and outer realms, our existence serving as a connecting bridge between the inner world of the soul and the outer world of the universe. But Freud emphasised this scientific material reduction of psychological phenomena, and for Jung, that emphasis for Freud rendered him blind to this holistic dimension of the soul, how it connects earth and heaven. So, as an example of how to treat the soul as a whole, Jung looks to the Bible, and so St. Paul taught that the children of God know freedom, and but that stands in conflict with Freudian psychoanalysis, which denies any validity to the idea of God as Father. So Jung is saying here that true freedom requires intuition